This is why inflation and economic instability aren't just policy numbers, guys, on a chart. They're a deep human crisis. When systems extract purchasing power from people who are already running on empty, you don't just take their dollars, you're taking their bandwidth, their sense of agency, their ability to care for themselves with dignity and make choices that honor their worth. In that depleted state, many turn to their bodies as the last resource that they can still access for quick pleasure, temporary control, or a feeling of being wanted. Research shows strong links between economic stress indicators like unemployment, debt, or inflation spikes, and rises in mental health crises, self-harm rates, and maladaptive coping behaviors. People with more adverse childhood experiences, known as ACEs, face even tougher economic outcomes later in life, and the cycle can keep feeding itself.
Taking a minute to be myself, don't need no help. We keep on rising.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Connie Davis, the host of Unlocking Commerce in Business. Listen, before we begin today, I want to be clear about what we're going to talk about. This episode addresses sexual violence, including the harm that we sometimes inflict on ourselves as coping mechanisms during times of extreme stress. Why am I talking about this? I'm approaching this topic with care during Sexual Violence Awareness Month because it's essential to understand how we exchange value or fail to in our communities. This isn't a departure from talking about commerce and business. We've been doing a lot of that. This is the conversation about what blocks the flow of value in our lives and our communities. If you need to pause or skip this one, I get it. I understand completely. And if you stay with me, know that my intention is to shine light on patterns that we don't often name, not to cause harm, but to begin to have a real conversation about what's really locking up commerce. So let's begin. You see, money has a heartbeat. I know that sounds strange coming from someone who spent 23 years in payment systems like me, building things like ATM networks and debit systems, mobile wallets even. And money's not supposed to be this afraid kind of fear-generating tool, but it is. Money was supposed to be neutral, mechanical, just ones and zeros moving through systems. But that's never been true, has it? You see, money pulses, it flows, it carries the rhythm of the people who earn it, who save it, who spend it, and lose it. And when that heartbeat becomes erratic, when it spikes with inflation or flatlines with extraction, our own biological heartbeats change too. You see, between 2020 and 2023, something happened to the heartbeat of money in this country, on the globe actually. The printing press ran, asset prices soared, and for millions of Americans who had done everything right, who had saved, who had invested conservatively, who had believed in the system, their purchasing power was quietly extracted. The index of consumer sentiment started relatively stable in 2021, but plummeted during peak inflation in 2022, hitting historic lows of 50 in June 2022 and hovering in the low 50s and 60s through much of the year, levels that hadn't been seen since the 2008 to 2009 financial crisis. It partially recovered in 2023 and 2024, but it remained volatile around 60s and high 60s and 70s by early 2024. But it was doing that amid ongoing economic pressures. Data from FRED series, UMC SENT, and the University of Michigan reports directly track this decline coinciding with inflation surges. So this wasn't a policy debate. This was your grocery bill, your rent, your ability to breathe, capital offense, just like we talked with Paul Moosen, author of the book. The extraction of wealth from those who saved at the expense of those who could print or borrow. And here's what we don't talk about enough. When external capital is extracted, internal coping mechanisms inside of our biological systems activate. Now, there's research out of Princeton and Harvard that changed how I really think about poverty and financial stress. That was the official data. But I've been exploring the communities and feeling the grassroots impacts of this data in communities for a long time now. According to a 2013 study published in Science by Mani, Molayanthan, Shafir, and Zhao, financial stress reduces cognitive bandwidth by up to 13 IQ points. That's the equivalent of losing a full night's sleep. Financial scarcity doesn't just take your money, it takes your mental bandwidth. It's like running too many programs on an old computer. Everything slows down. Your ability to make good decisions, to plan for the future, to care for yourself with dignity, all of that requires cognitive resources that financial stress consumes. Direct year-by-year correlations specific to 2021 to 2024, that same period of inflation, are limited in public data sets. But some data, BRFSS data, which tracks mental distress days and diagnosis of depression, shows that elevated poor mental health during periods of economic strain overlap with inflation. APA Stress in America reports from 2022 explicitly tied inflation and money worries to heightened psychological distress and increased help-seeking, with financial stress cited by large majorities as a driver of mental health issues. Broader analysis, it links rising unemployment and inflation indicators to higher utilization of mental health services and treatment costs. So when you're in that state, when your cognitive rates are being consumed just trying to survive today, your body and your brain start looking for relief anywhere they can find it. A moment of pleasure, a distraction from the pain, something, anything that feels like control when everything else is spinning or chaotic around you. And this is where the commerce conversation gets uncomfortable, guys, because the industries that profit from that desperation, they're tracking the same economic indicators that we are. So let's get into it. Let me show you what I mean with real numbers. For men, especially young men, the loneliness crisis is real and it's expensive. According to the American Survey Center on American Life back in 1990, only about 3% of men said that they had no close friends. By 2021, that number jumped to 15%, a 5-fold increase. And for men under 30, more than 1 in 4 reported having no close social connections at all. Gallup data from recent years showed young men aged 15 to 34 were among the loneliest in the Western world, with 1 in 4 saying that they felt lonely a lot of the day before. So when the economy feels shaky and life gets stressful, that disconnection, it hits even harder. When you're lonely, frustrated, disconnected, and the outside world keeps taking from you, where do you turn? The porn industry knows. During the pandemic and the high inflation years of 2021 to 2024, did you know that the global porn industry kept growing, with online platforms seeing huge jumps in subscriptions and traffic? OnlyFans, for example, exploded early in the pandemic, and overall digital adult content revenue climbed steadily, even as prices rose for everything else. People spent more time on these sites during lockdowns and economic stress. Search data, traffic reports showed clear spikes when folks felt isolated and overwhelmed. Dating apps also know. Match Group's revenue went from about $2.39 billion in 2020 to around $3.48 billion by 2024. Bumble grew from $580 million to over $1 billion in the same period. Premium subscriptions and extra features boomed during the pandemic as loneliness surged, with many users spending $18 to $20 a month on average just to feel seen or get a little attention. You see, these apps thrived on the same loneliness that economic uncertainty made worse. These aren't moral judgments. I'm not here to judge. These are economic realities. Men spending money and time trying to find connection, pleasure, relief, even when the exchange is extractive, even when it leaves them more isolated than before. And for women, the pattern looks different, but the economics are the same. You see, when you don't know your worth, when the outside world has taught you that your value is conditional, that you need to earn belonging, the marketplace, it's out there and it's ready for you. The beauty industry stayed strong during the economic stress of 2020 to 2024. Global beauty sales kept growing, with the sector expanding around 7% a year in recent reports, even as inflation squeezed budgets. Cosmetic procedures worldwide jumped significantly. Total surgical and non-surgical treatments rose about 40% from 2020 to 2024. Fast fashion and affordable treat-yourself buys also got held up. They held up, meaning they stayed steady, or they grew through e-commerce, as many women turned to small purchases to feel just a little bit better when times felt uncertain. Social media becomes that mirror that shows you what's missing, and the algorithm, it knows exactly what ad to serve when you're feeling not enough. This shows up in what economists sometimes call the lipstick effect. During tough economic times, people still spend on small, affordable luxuries like makeup, skincare, or a new outfit to lift their mood and feel put together, even if they cut back on bigger things. Consumer data from the pandemic and inflation years showed beauty and self-care categories holding strong or growing faster than many other retail areas, as folks reached for quick ways to feel worthy or in control. This is the commerce of not enoughness. Spending to become worthy, giving yourself away, your time, your attention, your body, in exchange for the illusion of value. And these are just examples among many coping-driven industries. Let me say that again. Coping-driven industries. They exist. Gambling and gaming exploded online. Alcohol and substances followed the same pattern. Liquor store sales jumped sharply in 2020, up about 20% during the early pandemic months. And home drinking stayed elevated through the inflation years. National surveys from SAMHSA and NIAAA show substance abuse disorders and co-occurring mental health struggles remaining high or ticked up slightly when economic and emotional stresses overlapped. Retail therapy and fast fashion kept pulling people in, sure. E-commerce and spending on clothes and beauty and all of the things, that stayed resilient, even as inflation made big purchases harder. But many people turned to those treat-yourself buys, that cheap, fast fashion hauls or small online orders. But it was all about emotional relief rather than smart long-term investments. But all of it, every dollar, every hour, flowing toward temporary relief from a pain that's getting worse. So this is where we're going to talk about sexual violence in a way that might feel a little uncomfortable for some of you. We often think of violence as a single dramatic event, an assault, an attack, something unmistakable and sudden, harmful, fearful, scary, and threatening. But research on trauma tells us something different. It's not always the one big blow that breaks you. What if it's the 1,000 small ones, the microaggressions that build over time until they start to feel normal? A 2021 study in The Counseling Psychologist looked at this directly. It found that repeated sexist microaggressions, those everyday little put-downs, dismissals, or invalidations, act like traumatic stressors. Over time, they erode your sense of self, they lower self-compassion, and they build up real trauma symptoms. The same pattern shows up in other studies on cumulative stress. The small hits keep coming. Your self-worth gets chipped away, and eventually your internal resources run dry. So every time that you dismiss your own needs because everyone else has it worse, every time you accept treatment that you know isn't right because you need the money, the job, the approval, every time you use your own body to cope with pain you can't even name, seeking quick pleasure to offset the ache, giving yourself away because at least someone wants something from you, these are all little mini acts of violence, not always from others, sometimes from ourselves, to ourselves. Sexual self-harm is real. It's when someone turns to sex, risky hookups, degrading situations, or even transactional encounters as a way to feel something, anything, when everything else feels numb or out of control. It gives temporary relief, but it keeps the cycle of extraction going. And the data from the pandemic and inflation years shows this pattern got worse when economic stress was high. Emergency department visits for intentional self-harm and suicide attempts skyrocketed between 2011 and 2020, jumping from about 1.43 million visits, which is 0.6% of all ER visits, to 5.37 million, a jump to 2.1% of all ER visits. That's an average annual increase of nearly 20%. The biggest spikes were happening right through 2020 to 2024 during lockdowns, isolation, and money worries. Are you seeing the pattern? Eating disorder rates also climbed sharply, and risky sexual behavior followed the same trend. When family or personal financial stress rises, people, especially younger adults, are more likely to engage in unprotected sex, casual encounters, or situations that feel degrading or unsafe. Studies show that this isn't random. It's often a way to regulate emotions when self-control resources are depleted by constant money worries and disconnection. This isn't about morality. This is about what happens when your internal resources are completely worn down and the external systems keep extracting your time, your energy, your body, your attention. The coping we talked about earlier, the porn, the apps, and the beauty spending, and the gambling, they all start to overlap with these microaggressions until the line between what's coping and harm gets blurry. And it may not just be for that person. It may be for everybody that's in their circle. When microaggressions pile up on top of economic pressure and loneliness, people become more vulnerable to exploitation, to coercion, to situations where consent gets clouded because saying no feels too expensive in every sense of the word. That's why this conversation matters for Sexual Violence Awareness Month. The violence doesn't always start with a stranger in a dark alley. Sometimes it starts with 1,000 quiet erosions that teach someone that their body, their boundaries, or their worth are negotiable. You see, we're going to look at these patterns and how they lead to real-world risks, and more importantly, what we can actually do about that. So here's the connection back to commerce. Here's why this matters for this show, this season, this mission of unlocking real value exchange in our communities. When people get stuck in patterns of self-harm, including sexual harm, as a way to cope, healthy commerce locks up. Because real healthy commerce needs agency. It needs you to be able to see your own worth clearly and exchange it for something of equal or greater value. It needs enough mental space, enough cognitive bandwidth to make choices that build things up instead of just helping you survive the day. But when your headspace is eaten up by trauma, by constant money worries, by that desperate search for any kind of relief. When your inner world starts running on an extractive model, taking from yourself at unsustainable rates just to get through to the next hour. You can't fully show up for communion-based commerce. You're stuck in survival mode. The money that goes to those quick coping fixes, porn subscriptions, dating app boosts, retail therapy halls, a few drinks, or a gamble, that is capital that could have gone towards something that actually grows, skills, relationships, a small business idea, or just peace of mind. The hours spent scrolling, swiping, or numbing out, that's time and attention that could have been building something meaningful with other people. And the dignity you trade away in those moments of desperation, that's value that's really hard to get back. Studies on consumer behavior during high-stress economic periods show exactly this pattern. When people feel financial pressure and emotional strain, they shift more towards spending towards short-term escapes and feel better purchases, like entertainment, substances, impulse buys, while cutting back on savings, investment, or longer-term needs. APA stress surveys and behavioral research confirm that money worries don't just tighten budgets, they narrow focus to immediate relief, making it harder to build for the future. And the heartbeat of money, it becomes erratic. The rhythm is distorted. Spending spikes on coping one day and crashes the next. Decisions get made in desperation instead of from a place of strength. Your internal economy starts to mirror the broken external one. This is why inflation and economic instability aren't just policy numbers, guys, on a chart. They're a deep human crisis. When systems extract purchasing power from people who are already running on empty, you don't just take their dollars, you're taking their bandwidth, their sense of agency, their ability to care for themselves with dignity and make choices that honor their worth. In that depleted state, many turn to their bodies as the last resource that they can still access for quick pleasure, temporary control, or a feeling of being wanted. The data backs up this clearly. Research shows strong links between economic stress indicators like unemployment, debt, or inflation spikes, and rises in mental health crises, self-harm rates, and maladaptive coping behaviors. People with more adverse childhood experiences, known as ACEs, face even tougher economic outcomes later in life, and the cycle can keep feeding itself. That's how we get to generational trauma. Studies during recessions and the 2020 to 2024 period found that financial hardship often leads to more shame, isolation, and risky ways of trying to feel better. This is not speculation, guys. This is what happens when external systems keep extracting your time, your energy, your attention, your money, and they leave people with little left over except their own bodies to borrow against. But here's the hopeful part. When we understand this connection, we can start to change it. By creating communities where people have real support, stable resources, and spaces to rebuild their sense of worth and agency, we unlock healthier value exchange. We move from extraction to communion, to restorative ecosystems that allow people to move from coping that depletes to connections that replenish. That is my mission. That's why we're talking about this during Sexual Violence Awareness Month, because the people have bandwidth and dignity intact. When that happens, they're far less likely to end up in situations where boundaries get crossed or consent gets clouded by desperation. In the next part of the episode, I'm going to explore practical ways that we can all help shift this, starting in our own lives and communities. You see, I focus on post-traumatic growth. I focus on commerce and the exchange of value. And with April being Sexual Violence Awareness Month, I'm speaking up because we need to expand our understanding of what sexual violence actually includes. Yes, it includes assault, harassment, abuse inflicted by others. All of this is real, devastating, and must be named and stopped. And in this post-Epstein era, it also includes, and it has to include because it's the beginning of the cycle, the violence that we inflict on ourselves when we're desperate for relief. Sometimes that violence extends to other people. When we use our own bodies in extractive ways because we don't know or have forgotten that we have worth beyond what we can produce, perform, or provide. This matters because healing our communities, protecting our children, protecting the future generation, and changing our systems, it has to start with recognition. You can't change a pattern that you don't name. And the pattern is this. When external systems extract capital from communities, individuals turn to internal extraction. Individuals turn to internal extraction. Think about that. The coping mechanisms that we choose, especially those involving our own bodies, become ways of surviving a system that's failing us. But survival is not the same as thriving, and extraction is not the same as exchange. The path forward requires us to see that connection. We have to talk about it. We have to plan around it. We have to disrupt it. Because economic stress leads to cognitive depletion, which leads to maladaptive coping, which leads to self-harm, including sexual self-harm, and a lockup of the exchange of value that we're no longer exchanging. Every part of this chain is real. Every part of it is measurable, and every part of it can be interrupted with the right interventions. So what do we do with all this? First, as I've been doing, we have to name it clearly. We stop pretending that economic policy is separate from human well-being. We stop treating financial stress like a personal failure instead of what it really is, a systemic extraction that drains people's bandwidth and dignity. And I know I created in season 1 at the very beginning of this show, I created a fun fintech Christmas carol. And I named, fictional characters like the Grinch and Santa Claus. But we have to start talking about this in real world examples. And the Epstein files have actually started that for us. It's the only gift that I can see from those files. Secondly, and next, most importantly, we have to rebuild bandwidth. People are running on empty, and they need real resources, not judgment. This means accessible mental health support. They need some financial breathing room and genuine community connection. These are not luxuries, people. They are the basic prerequisites for healthy commerce and healthy lives. That is the premise of Maslow's hierarchy. Research from SAMHSA shows that trauma-informed care approaches and those approaches that realize the widespread impact of trauma and recognize its signs, respond with compassion, and actively resist re-traumatization, those types of policies and programs make a real difference. It's why I focus on post-traumatic growth. When implemented well, it leads to better mental health outcomes, reduced symptoms of depression and distress, greater self-efficacy, and even improvements in economic security. One study found that trauma-informed peer support, combined with financial education, helped people lower depression, cut back on harmful coping like alcohol, and feel more in control of their lives. Restoring bandwidth through these kinds of supports help people move from survival mode back to making choices that build something better. Third, we have to teach a different model of value exchange. We move toward communion-based commerce instead of constant extraction. This is the emotional economic empowerment theory that I authored for Inspire World Foundation, where we want and we aspire and we have a mission to help people understand that their worth isn't conditional on what they produce or perform. That intimacy with themselves and understanding their emotional design so that they can better navigate and interact with others, that's not a commodity to be traded away in moments of depression or desperation. Real connection and real exchange happen when people feel safe enough to show up as whole human beings. Next, we have to hold systems accountable. Monetary policies that quietly extract from everyday savers and hand those gains over to asset holders. That's a capital offense with a very human consequence. Industries that profit from desperation without offering genuine healing or value, we got to name those clearly. We must push for smarter regulation. And most importantly, we build kinder, more generative alternatives in our own communities. And last but not least, this one's the hardest. We have to extend real compassion to ourselves and to others who are caught in these patterns. Because shame is not healing anyone, guys. Judgment is not restoring communities or bringing the bandwidth back. What does restore us is simple recognition. I see you. I see what's happening. I see why that choice made sense in that moment. And there's another way forward. Money has a heartbeat. And when that heartbeat is healthy, when it pushes with generative exchange instead of extractive taking, it starts to heal our own hearts too. When you can recognize your own value and exchange it fairly in your work, in your relationships, and especially in how you treat your own body, something powerful unlocks. That is magic. Not just for you, but it's for your whole community. Because value flows where dignity lives. And dignity always starts with the relationship that you have with yourself. So thank you for sitting with me here with this heavy and hopeful conversation during Sexual Violence Awareness Month. If any part of this resonated, or if you're carrying some of that weight right now, know that you're not alone. Small steps toward rebuilding bandwidth and choosing compassion can create ripples that change everything. Take care of yourselves out there. And let's please keep building communities where people don't have to borrow against their bodies just to feel okay. This April, during Sexual Violence Awareness Month, I want you to ask yourself some questions. Where is my time going? Where is my money flowing? And what am I trading myself for? If the answer includes coping mechanisms that extract from you instead of nourishing you, porn, hookup apps, substances, retail therapy, gambling, giving yourself away, I'm not here to shame you. I'm here to tell you that the pattern makes sense. The system designed it that way, but you don't have to stay stuck in it. Your body is not collateral. Your intimacy is not a commodity. Your worth is not measured by what you can produce in a moment of desperation. You are the first market, the first place where commerce either works or it breaks. And when you learn to exchange value with yourself, when you take time for rest, attention for healing, resources for genuine nourishment, and instead of temporary relief, that unlocks everything else. This is why I do this work. Why I talk about fintech and trauma in the same breath. Why I connect monetary policy to sexual violence. Because it's all one system, guys. And the heartbeat connects all of it. Money has a heartbeat. Make sure yours is strong. This is Connie Davis, signing off. Thank you for listening to Unlocking Commerce and Business. If this conversation resonated, here's what you can do. Subscribe for weekly conversations with survivors, innovators, and changemakers, building regenerative alternatives to extractive commerce. Share this episode with collaborators, partners, funders, and changemakers in your network. The people ready for restorative commerce need to hear these voices. Drop a comment below. Tell us what patterns you're recognizing or what solutions you're building. We read every one. Commerce is everywhere, and healing extraction patterns inside our communities creates regenerative commerce outside. Like a lighthouse, we're here, exploring and cutting through fog, pointing toward what works. Welcome to the era of restorative commerce. Until next time, explore courageously, build sovereignly. You are the source and store of value. This is Connie Davis, signing off. Thank you for being here.